The blood trail led straight to his barn. Elijah McCall stood frozen in the Dakota morning frost, his weathered hands gripping the coffee mug that had gone cold minutes ago. 62 years of ranching had taught him to read signs, and these dark droplets painting a path across his property told a story he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something human. His blue eyes, faded but sharp, followed the crimson dots that disappeared into the shadows of his old wooden barn. Someone was in there. Someone hurt. And on his land, that made it his problem. Elijah set the mug on the porch railing with deliberate care, the same methodical precision he'd used for everything since Martha died 23 years ago. His boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as he approached the barn, each step measured and cautious. The massive sliding door stood slightly ajar, which was wrong. He always secured that door. Always. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dakota plains, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out across the endless grassland that had been McCall land for 3 generations. Inside the barn, a soft whimper broke the silence. Elijah's hand instinctively moved to the rifle he kept by the door, but something in the sound made him pause. Fear. Pain. Desperation. He'd heard those notes before, in wounded animals, in his own voice the night Martha didn't come home from town. Slowly, he pushed the door wider, allowing more light to flood the space where he kept his tools, his memories, and apparently, an uninvited guest. She was huddled in the far corner, partially hidden behind old hay bales, but the morning light revealed enough. A young woman, maybe 19, with long black hair matted with sweat and blood. Her clothes were torn, traditional patterns mixed with modern fabric, and her dark eyes held the kind of wariness that comes from being hunted. But it was the wound on her leg that made Elijah's breath catch. Deep, bleeding freely, and clearly beyond what basic first aid could handle. She needed help, real help, and she needed it now. When their eyes met, time seemed to stretch like taffy in summer heat. She spoke first, words in a language he didn't understand but recognized from childhood memories of his father trading horses with tribal elders. Lakota, he thought, though he couldn't be sure. Her voice was weak but determined, and she clutched something small in her hand, some kind of carved wooden pendant that caught the light. Elijah raised his hands slowly, palms open, the universal gesture of peace that needed no translation. Easy now, he said, his voice rusty from disuse. I'm not going to hurt you. The words felt inadequate, but he kept his tone low and steady, the same voice he used with spooked horses. She watched him with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, calculating whether this graying stranger represented salvation or another threat to add to whatever had driven her here. Elijah took a single step forward, then stopped when she tensed. The blood on her leg was spreading, staining the hay beneath her, and he could see she was losing strength. Medical attention meant town, and town meant questions he wasn't prepared to answer. But leaving her here meant watching someone die on his property, and that was something his conscience couldn't bear. The moral arithmetic was simple, even if the consequences weren't. Let me help, he said, gesturing toward her injured leg. She followed his gaze, then looked back at his face, searching for something only she could recognize. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she slowly extended her wounded leg, never taking her eyes off his face. The trust in that gesture hit him harder than he expected, a reminder of human connection he'd almost forgotten existed. As Elijah knelt beside her, careful to move slowly and keep his hands visible, he noticed details that would matter later. The quality of her clothing, handmade but expensive. The calluses on her hands that spoke of skilled work. The small scars that marked someone who lived close to the land. And most importantly, the way she'd found his barn, as if she'd known exactly where to go in a landscape that could swallow a person whole. The wound was worse up close, a jagged tear that would require stitches and antibiotics. But her eyes never left his face as he examined the injury, and when he looked up, she spoke again in Lakota, then struggled to find English words. Thank you, she whispered, and the simple phrase carried weight that made his chest tight. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn doors and carrying the promise of a storm that would change everything for both of them. The kitchen smelled of antiseptic and strong coffee, two scents that shouldn't belong together but somehow fit the strange morning Elijah McCall was having. Ayanna sat stiffly on his deceased wife's chair, the first person to occupy it in over 2 decades, while he cleaned and dressed her wound with supplies from the veterinary kit he kept for the horses. Her leg was worse than he'd first thought, requiring 12 careful stitches, but she'd endured the improvised surgery without a sound, only the tightening around her dark eyes betraying the pain. She'd refused his offer to drive her to the hospital in Rapid City, shaking her head with such vehemence that he didn't press the issue. Now, watching her sip the herbal tea she'd requested instead of coffee, Elijah wondered what kind of trouble could make a young woman choose a stranger's barn over professional medical care. The wooden pendant she wore caught the morning light streaming through windows Martha had cleaned for the last time 23 years ago, and he found himself curious about the intricate carvings that covered its surface. "Ayanna," she said suddenly, touching her chest with one finger. The words sounded like music in his sparse kitchen, syllables that belonged to wind in wide spaces. When she pointed at him with raised eyebrows, he understood. "Elijah," he replied, and watched her mouth shape the unfamiliar sounds. She nodded once, satisfied, then gestured toward the window that faced the endless Dakota prairie. Her hands moved gracefully as she spoke in Lakota, painting pictures he couldn't understand but somehow felt. When she switched to broken English, her accent made the words sound like prayers. "Family," she said, pointing toward the distant hills. "Looking. 3 days." Her expression grew troubled, and she touched the bandage on her leg. "Fell. Gathering medicine plants. For grandmother. Very sick." The simple explanation carried layers of meaning that made Elijah's chest tighten. She'd been on some kind of spiritual or medicinal mission when the accident happened, and now her family was searching for her while she recovered in a stranger's house. The implications settled over him like a heavy blanket. Harboring someone without notifying authorities could bring complications he wasn't prepared to handle, especially given the complex relationship between local law enforcement and tribal members. But sending her away in her condition wasn't an option his conscience could accept. The arithmetic of right and wrong had always been simpler on the ranch than in town, where politics and prejudice muddied every decision. Ayanna seemed to sense his internal struggle. She reached into a small leather pouch at her waist and withdrew a handful of what looked like ordinary pebbles, but when she placed them on Martha's old table, he saw they were something more. Each stone bore painted symbols and colors that seemed to capture sunlight, and she arranged them in a pattern that felt significant even though he couldn't read its meaning. "Protection," she said, her English careful but clear. "For house. For man who helps." She touched each stone as she spoke, and Elijah found himself leaning forward despite his usual skepticism about such things. There was something in her manner, a certainty that transcended language barriers, that made the painted rocks seem less like superstition and more like a form of communication he'd never learned to read. That afternoon, while Ayanna rested on the couch where he sometimes fell asleep watching late-night cattle reports, Elijah found himself checking the windows more often than usual. The isolation that had been his comfort for 2 decades suddenly felt like vulnerability. What if her family didn't know where to look? What if they assumed the worst? What if local authorities got involved before he could figure out the right thing to do? The questions multiplied as evening approached, bringing with it a restlessness he hadn't felt in years. When Ayanna woke from her nap, she moved to the window that faced east, toward Pine Ridge, and stood there for a long time without speaking. The setting sun painted her profile in shades of gold and amber, and for a moment Elijah saw past her injury and circumstances to the strength that had carried her across miles of difficult terrain to find help. "They will come," she said softly, without turning from the window. "When the morning star rises. Family always comes." There was certainty in her voice that made him believe her, even though he wasn't sure he was ready for whatever that reunion might bring. The painted stones on Martha's table seemed to catch the last light of day, and for the first time since his wife's death, the old house felt less empty. Outside, the Dakota wind began to sing through the cottonwoods, carrying promises and secrets across the vast landscape that had witnessed centuries of meetings between strangers who became something more. the morning star was barely visible against the pre-dawn sky when Elijah heard them coming. Not the rumble of engines he'd expected, but the soft rhythm of horses moving across grassland, a sound that belonged to another century but felt perfectly natural in the Dakota silence. He'd been awake since 3, unable to sleep with Ayana's prediction echoing in his mind, and now he stood at the kitchen window watching shadows take shape in the gray light that preceded sunrise. Ayana appeared beside him without a sound, moving with the quiet grace he'd noticed since she'd been staying in his house. Her wound was healing faster than he'd thought possible, though she still favored the injured leg. She'd washed her hair in his bathroom the night before, and now it hung loose around her shoulders, catching what little light filtered through the window. When she saw the approaching riders, her whole posture changed, tension melting away like frost under morning sun. "My uncle," she said softly, pointing to the lead rider. "Joseph Crowfeather. And my cousin David." She spoke their names with the kind of reverence reserved for family who'd earned it through love rather than obligation. Elijah counted 5 riders total, all moving with the easy confidence of people who'd been born to horseback in wide spaces. They stopped just outside his fence line, respecting property boundaries while making their presence known. The lead rider, a man who looked to be in his 50s with gray threading through hair that hung past his shoulders, raised one hand in greeting. Even from a distance, Elijah could see the family resemblance in the set of his shoulders and the way he sat his horse like he'd grown there. Joseph Crowfeather had the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that mattered, and his presence filled the empty morning with authority that demanded respect. Ayana moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Elijah. "Come," she said simply. "Time to meet." The invitation carried weight that went beyond politeness, and he found himself following her onto the porch where Martha used to shell peas and watch storms build over the horizon. The painted stones she'd arranged on his table seemed to pulse with meaning he was only beginning to understand. Joseph dismounted with fluid grace and approached the fence, his eyes taking in everything from Elijah's work clothes to the condition of the barn and the way Ayana moved on her healing leg. When he spoke, his English was precise and unaccented, the voice of someone educated in 2 worlds. "Mr. McCall," he said, somehow knowing the name without introduction. "I am Joseph Crowfeather. Thank you for caring for my niece." The formal words carried layers of meaning that made Elijah feel like he was participating in something larger than a simple reunion. He nodded once, unsure of the appropriate response. "She needed help," he said finally. Anyone would have done the same. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't entirely true. Not everyone would have opened their door to a stranger. Not everyone would have risked the complications. Joseph's smile was slight but warm. "Perhaps. But you did." He gestured to the other riders, who remained mounted but watchful. "We have been searching since she did not return from gathering medicine for her grandmother. The old woman is better now, thanks to plants Ayana collected before her accident." The information felt like a gift, confirmation that the young woman's mission had succeeded despite the cost. Ayana spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing toward the house and pointing to her bandaged leg. Joseph listened with the attention of someone who understood that details mattered, especially when dealing with the collision of different worlds. When she finished, he studied Elijah with eyes that seemed to measure not just his words but his intentions. "She tells me you asked for nothing," Joseph said after a long moment. "No payment. No questions about why she could not go to hospital. This is unusual in my experience with your people." The observation wasn't accusatory, just factual, and Elijah found himself wondering what experiences had shaped that perspective. "Didn't seem right to ask for payment," Elijah replied. "And her reasons were her own business." The answer seemed to satisfy something in Joseph's expression, and the older man nodded as if confirming a suspicion. Around them, the Dakota morning was beginning to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the horses stood patient as monuments while 2 different worlds tried to find common ground. What happened next would determine whether this meeting ended in understanding or something more complicated that none of them were prepared to handle. Joseph reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred things. As he unwrapped it, Elijah saw items that seemed to capture morning light and hold it, each piece crafted with the kind of patience that belonged to people who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. A dream catcher woven with horsehair and eagle feathers, stones painted with symbols that seemed to tell stories, and a carved staff that felt ancient even though it might have been made yesterday. "These are gifts," Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "Not payment. Gifts carry different meaning. They create connection between giver and receiver, binding them in respect that lasts beyond the moment." He placed each item carefully on the fence post between them, creating a small altar of gratitude that transformed the ordinary morning into something that felt timeless. Ayanna limped forward and added her own offering, the wooden pendant she'd clutched throughout her recovery. "For protection of house," she said in careful English. "For man who opens heart when others close doors." The simple words hit Elijah harder than any elaborate speech could have, carrying truth that made his chest tight with emotions he'd forgotten how to name. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Dakota landscape in shades of gold and green, Joseph began to speak about things Elijah had never considered. How the land held memory. How kindness to strangers was considered sacred in Lakota tradition. How his decision to help Ayanna without asking questions had honored protocols older than the state boundaries that now divided tribal land from ranch land. "My father traded horses with your father," Joseph said suddenly, the revelation hitting Elijah like a physical blow. 40 years ago, near the old cottonwood by Wounded Knee Creek. Your father was fair man, paid good price, showed respect for our ways. Some things pass from father to son, even when son does not know he carries them." The connection reached across decades, linking past and present in ways that made the morning feel charged with significance. Elijah found himself remembering fragments of stories his father had told about trading with tribal horsemen, tales he'd dismissed as outdated frontier nostalgia. Now, standing face to face with Joseph Crowfeather, those memories took on new weight. The isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor suddenly felt less like protection and more like self-imposed exile from connections that might have enriched his life beyond measure. Over the following weeks, as autumn painted the Dakota hills in shades of fire and gold, the gifts began appearing exactly as Ayanna had predicted. Not intrusively, but placed with careful respect where Elijah would notice them during his morning rounds. A painted stone by the water trough. Eagle feathers tied to his fence posts. Small bundles of sage left on his porch steps. Each offering felt like a conversation he was finally learning to hear. The isolation that had defined his life since Martha's death slowly gave way to something warmer. Joseph stopped by occasionally, usually with practical reasons like checking fence lines or sharing weather information, but their conversations gradually moved beyond ranching to larger questions about land stewardship and community responsibility. Ayanna visited once her leg healed completely, bringing her grandmother's famous fry bread and stories that made the old house echo with laughter it hadn't heard in decades. On cold November evenings, when wind howled across the prairie with winter's promise, Elijah found himself sitting on the porch Martha had loved, watching the dream catcher Joseph had given him dance in the lamplight. The painted stones caught moonbeams and seemed to glow with inner fire, and for the first time since his wife's death, the ranch felt less like a retreat from the world and more like a bridge between different ways of understanding what it meant to belong to the land. The morning star still rose over Pine Ridge, and now Elijah knew its name in 2 languages, understanding finally that some gifts change everything, especially when they arrive carried by wounded strangers who teach us that helping others is just another way of helping ourselves find our way home. What an incredible journey we've shared together. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine while creating it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Did Elijah's transformation remind you of a time when helping a stranger changed your own perspective? Have you ever experienced that moment when kindness creates unexpected connections? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the beautiful complexity of human connection. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of opening our hearts to others, and ring the notification bell so you never miss these emotional journeys we take together. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we simply choose to help.